Hi, welcome to chapter 10 of Earth Science. We made it to double digits. All right, let's get started with this chapter, which is titled A Biography of the Earth. So the book starts off with talking about a geologist named Henry Hulsey, who looked at a piece of chalk. Now, you may look at a piece of chalk, and similar to the ones you'd find here at the Cliffs of Dover, and you may say it's pretty boring, it's just a piece of chalk. But Thomas Huxley now had the advantage of using a microscope, and has stated, whether you know the true history of chalk, he told his workers, we will have a truer and therefore better conception of the wonderful universe around us. So he's looking at chalk, and there's a lot of information that can be gleaned from these little bits of chalk. If you look at the chalk under a microscope, you might see these kind of rounded organisms, and these organisms aren't around today. So Thomas Huxley had a kind of revelation that stated that life has changed over time, and so that was a profound statement to be made at that time. So just a brief recap from the prelude chapter, we talked about how in our galaxy we had materials that started to accrue, and we're going to look at this from the aspect of time, and so the history of the Earth, and we're going to call this time period the Hadean. It literally means the Hades on Earth, where we would have had really, really hot temperatures on the Earth's surface. From 4.54 billion years to 4 billion years ago, we use that G to represent GA for billion years ago, if you see that in your text. So the Earth accumulated small planetesimals, again, those little bits of materials that are accruing. And what's going to happen once you get large enough, heavier materials would sink towards the center. And so we call this the Hadean time period, the Hadean eon. And so when we start looking at this Hadean, this is where we start having the Earth starting to differentiate between the crust, the mantle, and the core. And that crust would have been just starting to occur. In fact, at this point, there wouldn't have been any continents. And that's very shortly after the Earth formed. You will recall from a previous chapter that the Earth was bombarded by another object, which ultimately the remnants of this material became the moon. And if you haven't seen the video in the ancillary webpage, I encourage you to go back and look at that. It's a pretty good demonstration of what would happen where a body of material would hit, all of the leftover ejected material would later coalesce to form our moon. And so during this time, here's some artist renditionings of these molten materials where lava would have just been coming out all over the Earth's surface. Outgassing of carbon dioxide would have been occurring at this time, sulfur dioxide, and there wouldn't have been any oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere at this time. So the next time period that we're going to be looking at is the Archean eon. And again, when we're looking at these eons, these are vast majorities of the time. We can think of these as kind of centuries as opposed to eras, which would be more like years. And then we can look at periods, which are even smaller yet. Maybe we can think of those as months. And then we can get all the way down to the seconds. Smaller and smaller time frames. So in this large time frame called the Archean, so my little time scale on the left is showing you that we're getting a little bit closer to recent, we would have stopped having some of the bombardment of particulates, because there wouldn't have been as much in our solar system at that time. This is when we start seeing evidence of oceans forming, and those any carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, some of those would have been trapped in the ocean. The atmosphere primarily would have been nitrogen. This is when we start having plates occurring, and we'd see our first bits of continental crust. Now, it's really difficult to look at these continental crusts and say, what did the continents look like? The problem with this is that these continents are constantly being reworked, and so any remnants of the Archean materials, we'd expect to find very few of them, and as it turns out, that's when we did find them. Something else very unique happened in the oceans there. We do find evidence of microscopic life occurred in the Archean. So again, in that Archean, we started having life. And so this is kind of the artist's renditioning of some late heavy bombardment towards the end of the Hadean, beginning of the Archean. So when we start having crust, what's going to happen is, remember from our chapters on plate tectonics, that more colder or more dense mafic rich materials tends to get reworked in back into the mantle, into the asthenosphere. And so what's going to happen is, effectively, we would not have continental collisions. We'd have mainly ocean-continental convergence or ocean-ocean convergence. And anytime we had any bit of rock that was a little bit less iron in there, or more felsic, it would start to it wouldn't sink back down, and so you'd have these little bits of rock that ultimately would start accumulating, and so these Archean little less dense materials are going to start to build up. So these buoyant rocks, these rocks that are less dense, are going to form protocontinents, and then what's going to happen is through chemical fractionation, some of these rocks, when they start working their way up, are going to become more felsic. Remember, they're going to melt the rock around them. Granite has a lower melting point. Silica has a lower melting point, so it's going to start to rise up and leave behind some of the more iron-rich materials. And so we'd start having, in some places in the interior of these continents, we can actually start to get little bits of granite. And those are, in fact, we have found those bits of granite. Lots and lots of metamorphic rocks. These rocks are under tremendous amounts of pressure. And so we have some examples of those there. But by the time we end the Archean and begin the Proterozoic, we've started to accumulate a lot of that continental crust. Now, these continental crusts will, again, get collided and moved around, and so the shapes of these continents are going to be severely altered. We're going to start having enough fractionation that any of the silicate materials are going to be pushed towards the Earth's surface, and we'll have much more fractionation of the Earth. So when we start having these life occurring in the Archean, this is not the diversity of life that we find today. A lot of the life in these regions are going to be things called are found in these samples called stromatolites, which are mats of cyanobacteria. Now, just like all bacteria, these bacteria are prokaryotes, which mean that they don't really have a defined nucleus. We are eukaryotes, and we have, again, clearly defined nucleuses in our cells. So these were not very evolved life forms, but they are very, very, very important to life on Earth, because these cyanobacteria are the first life on Earth. And so, again, found in those stromatolites. So at this time, these organisms are producing energy through photosynthesis and more photosynthesis and more photosynthesis. And then as a result, some of the excess amount of oxygen went up into the atmosphere. When this oxygen went into the atmosphere, now our atmosphere contains oxygen for a second. But then what's going to happen is we have this stuff on the atmosphere which reacts with this oxygen. A lot of people don't realize how reactive and how volatile oxygen is. It is highly reactive. And so what would happen was, as soon as oxygen came into the atmosphere, all of a sudden then we would have oxygen rusting all this iron that's still at the Earth's surface. As a result, we end up with rocks that are going to have these layers of period of oxidation and then a reduced state, oxidated and then a reduced state. And so I don't know how well you can see this, but we end up with something called the banded iron formations, big iron deposits. This sample is found in Michigan, or was found in Michigan. But we have this this hematite and chert environments because the atmosphere had a little extra oxygen, it rusted, and then it was a reduced state, and we didn't have this rust development. And so these banded iron formations are where, again, we are trapped in a tremendous amount of iron. So from an economic standpoint, that's a really great center. And so this is also when in the Proterozoic was when we start having large continents. Now, we define a supercontinent as a continent that where most of the continents have joined together. And so there have been a number of large supercontinents. The first one that your book uses is one called Rodinia, and a very large supercontinent, undisputed as a supercontinent. And then Rodinia broke apart, and then we had our second supercontinent called Panotia, and then that broke apart, and and then we had our third supercontinent called Pangaea. Now, you may be very familiar with Pangaea because it was the most recent supercontinent, but that is the most recent one, but not the only supercontinent. Some other things that have occurred in this Proterozoic. We started having eukaryotes developing, again, organisms with a nucleus, paired chromosomes, DNA. And one other thing is we had violent swings in the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Again, carbon dioxide was used up in the process of photosynthesis, and carbon dioxide is really good at holding heat in. And so as a result, we had what was deemed as snowball Earth, where the entire Earth, even at the equator, at sea level, froze over. You don't trap in that heat, you allow that heat. If we start having a snowfall event, a glacier will start to accumulate that can block out the sun and reflect increase the albedo of the Earth, and then that snowball, the glaciers can get larger and larger and larger. If we don't have carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to trap in that heat, that's glacier can continue to grow unchecked. And so during this time in the Earth's past, we had this snowball Earth. How do we know it was a snowball Earth? Because areas that were on the equator had glacial deposits at sea level. Um, your book has some examples of some of this glacial materials. How do we know where where rocks were at the equator? Well, back in our chapter on plate tectonics, we looked at iron crystals, and those iron crystals will align to the North Pole. And so then if you were at the North Pole, those iron crystals would shoot straight down. If they were horizontal, that would indicate that they are in fact on the equator as they point towards the North Pole into the Earth. And so we can actually use iron crystals to figure out our latitude. Not our longitude, but our latitude. It's definitely something. And so we can actually see that we were right at the equator, and we had glacial material right at the equator in multiple different locations. And so again, this is when we also created tremendous amounts of continents. So as I've already mentioned, here's a better image of this banded iron formation where we had an increase in oxygen, and then we had a reduction event where the iron was coming in contact with this oxygen. It would precipitate out as hematite, and then the sequence would continue fluctuating above oxygen from the atmosphere being taken out of the atmosphere from rust. So when we start looking at those the first two supercontinents here, again, they are going to look very, very different than modern continents. So we start looking at Rodinia because the shapes of these continents are going to be reworked again. And so the first supercontinent is Rodinia, from 1 billion years to 700 million years old. And then the second one, about 570 million years ago, but it wasn't around very much. And that's, we didn't have as much evidence of that over a longer period of time, but it did in fact occur. And then we'll talk about our Pangea here in just a little bit. So some of the life in the Proterozoic, these organisms, we had a lot of photosynthesis occurring in this environment, and oxygen was in fact a byproduct. And so, as you mentioned, the snowball Earth, where we had glacial till found in areas at low elevation at the equator. And so then how can we ever get out of a snowball Earth? Well, it's going to take an influx of CO2. Fortunately, volcanoes give us a lot of CO2. And so putting out the CO2 did in fact cause the Earth to warm back up. So moving on to our Paleozoic era, and these very, very, very large time frames. The Phanerozoic eon, the Paleozoic era, this was indicated by abundant amounts of shells. Now, there very well might have been a lot more organisms, but shells are easily preserved. And so we do know that we had abundant amount of organisms. In fact, this was often just dubbed as the Cambrian explosion, where we have tremendous amounts of materials. And so the Cambrian time period comes from Cambridge, England, where we started looking at the rocks around there, and there was tons and tons of these shells. An increase in the oxygen atmosphere coincided with this region. And so when we start looking at the Phanerozoic visible life, for those of you who aren't speaking other languages, the word zoic means life, phanera means visible, And so then we can break the Phanerozoic eon into subdivided into 3 different eras. And again, going back to my description, we can start looking at centuries versus decades, and then we can look at decades into years. And so this era, which is part of these 3 eras, are part of this one eon, this visible eon, and we're still in this Phanerozoic eon right now. We're located at 0 years old, so we're up at the top of this Cenozoic. And so when we start looking at the Paleozoic, old life, Mesozoic, middle life, Cenozoic, recent life. And then when we start looking at these time periods, which are, we can think of these as years, again, smaller time units. The Cambrian was defined originally as the rocks around this region. And then if we looked just a little bit from Cambridge, we saw some rocks that were a little bit further away, but they were on top, and so they were called the Ordovician, named after the a Druid monk, I believe. And then when we start looking at even younger, we've got the Silurian and the Devonian. I know Devonshire is where the Devonian comes from. The Carboniferous, carbon rich, and then the Permian, Perma, the region of Perma in Europe as well. So we can see that these areas in the Paleozoic were defined primarily in in Europe. The Carboniferous is one that we're going to be looking at. There's 2 different portions of the Carboniferous that we actually have here in the United States, the Mississippian and the Pennsylvanian. And so if you see those terms, they're talking about that Carboniferous region. So where did we start seeing abundant shells? During that Cambrian explosion. So during that Cambrian and then in the Ordovician time periods, we had different land masses that started to accrue, but they weren't truly supercontinents because they weren't all connected yet. They were getting larger. Again, they were moving apart, but ultimately they did come back together to form Pangaea, but this is pre-Pangaea. We have here we are in Laurasia here, and you'll notice that South America and North America are nowhere near each other. And Laurasia looks very, very not much like North America. We also had some internal seas in this region, epicontinental seas, these shallow seas that would move in for vast locations. I do want to point out that Florida is actually attached over here next part of Africa, and you can see kind of the outline of where Africa eventually is going to look like, and South America. Now, in this Cambrian explosion, we see lots and lots of organisms with shells. Again, we see them because they're still, the shell fragments have been preserved. We see things like nautiloids, trilobites. Those trilobites, again, we see a lot of those here in Missouri. We can see a lot of these rocks from the Ordovician, and here on in Park Hills, we have some of these Ordovician rocks exposed. And so there's one hypothesis is when these continents broke apart, the life on these different continents were altered and so we had lots of different speciation occurred, and so that may explain why we had so much life in this region or on Earth. And so when we start understanding what happened in the past, This is known as paleogeography, the shape of the lands over over the history of time. Coming back to the United States, we had the Calderian orogeny, mountain building event, where Baltica and Laurasia collided, and these two continents, microcontinents, formed the old Rocky Mountains. The eastern portion of the United States also had a series of microcontinents to form the Arcadian orogeny. This is where Arcadia National Forest is in northeast part of the United States. And then we've had other orogenies or mountain building events creating various mountain ranges. Some big changes occurred in the Silurian and the Devonian. The Silurian had some invertebrate fossils like spiders and insects that have occurred. During the Devonian, we had some plants, some woody plants that started to take place. Some of the, at this point, we would have had a ozone layer. The oxygen from the atmosphere would have gotten high enough concentrations to start forming ozone. And this would have started to protect organisms, and so they can start from being destroyed by UV light, and so they can start to be found on land. And so we start seeing vertebrates found on land. At the end of the late Paleozoic era, we've had the Carboniferous and Permian periods. We had abundance of life on land. A lot of the carbon, we had a lot of plant life on land. And so when we start looking here in the United States, we've got tremendous thick, lush plant vegetation, which later will become our great coal deposits. At this time, we would have actually formed Pangaea. And this has occurred when Gondwanaland collided with Eurasia. So ultimately, over how many supercontinents have occurred over the last billion years? Again, since in the last billion years, that would have been Rodinia, Pannotia, and Pangaea. So at this time, when this collision occurred, when we formed Pangaea, the crash was felt all the way across the eastern seaboard, because we would have now collided these continents and created a big mountain range. We had a continental convergent plate boundary. As a result, you can still see the effects of this, where these rocks have all buckled up. We know these now as the Appalachian Mountains. So as we've already mentioned, the Carboniferous time period had large coal deposits here in the United States. The atmospheric pressure was very high. As a result, organisms insects could grow to quite a large time period. This looks like a Smilodon, Dimetrodon, in this organism. On the right there, this amphibian, this earliest reptile, it actually had eggs on land and lived its life on land, as opposed to some amphibians, which also would have been occurring in this Carboniferous time period and Permian time period. Now, everything was going along quite nicely, but as it turns out, we had a large extinction event. Now, this is well before the dinosaurs even were a thought. But this, all of a sudden, we started looking at the geologic record and we see virtually not much. 96% of marine organisms died, 70% of terrestrial species are no longer found. Sometimes this area, time is referred to as the Great Dying. So you may have heard about the dinosaurs going extinct, but that's not the only time that we've had a great extinction event. We've had 5 different extinction events. At the end of the Ordovician, we lost about 86% of the diversity of life. At the end of the Devonian, we had about 75% of the life. And then this one, again, 96% of marine species. At the end of the Triassic, we had 80% of the end of the Triassic, about 200 million years ago, we had 80% of the life going extinct. And then we had the dinosaurs going extinct at the end of the Cretaceous, about 76% of life going extinct, the diversity of life. So at the end of which periods did a mass extinction event occur? If we're starting to look as the big one, the Great Dying, it would have been the Permian extinction event. And where do we have a bunch of massive swamp deposits developing, forming huge coal deposits? This would have been the Carboniferous, and this would make a lot of sense if we had a new habitat. The atmosphere was conducive to plant life, but not, the UV rays were still a little too harsh for animals, and so these plants could propagate and propagate and propagate, and not have anything break these plants down, and so we end up with these huge coal deposits. Now, moving on to the middle of the Mesozoic era, the Triassic and the Jurassic time periods. At this in this Mesozoic area, Pangea started to break up. We had at this point we've had animals both on land and water. We had a series of warmer climate periods that some of the polar glaciers melted off, and this is when we started having dinosaurs in this Triassic and Jurassic periods. But if you're thinking back to Jurassic, I've heard that Jurassic Park, most of the dinosaurs from Jurassic Park were actually from the Cretaceous. We'll get to the Cretaceous here for a second. But dinosaurs first appeared in the Triassic. In the Triassic and Jurassic, which is part of the Mesozoic. And so this question is asking, what is the era that we had dinosaurs occurring? So in this Mesozoic era, again, we had dinosaurs occurring. The continents start to look more like their similar shape. We start having the formation of the Atlantic Ocean. By the time we hit the end of the Mesozoic and the Cretaceous period, India is moving on a collision. Here we can see it hasn't quite hit Eurasia yet, but it will. It's moving in this general direction. South America and Africa have still pulled apart, and we stole a little bit of the area of around Africa in Florida here. And so as these rocks are starting to look very similar to what we have here today. Here in the United States, during this Cretaceous time period, we had this area, with the exception of a small section of southeast Missouri near Crawley's Ridge, if you're familiar. We were underwater during this Cretaceous interior sea. How can you end up with an interior sea in this area? Well, sea level fluctuates quite a bit as a number of different reasons. One is the height of the continents. The other is what's happening in the ocean. Your book has a little insert that talked about putting some rocks in a lake and watching what happens to sea level. Well, it's going to go up. Well, if we have lots of seafloor spreading occurring, that mid-ocean ridge is going to take up a lot more volume, and so the water has to go somewhere, so it will cause sea level to rise. And so if we take a look at Florida, it was underwater. We're on this North American area had a huge region of an interior sea here. On the western part of the United States, we've got some more subduction taking place. At this time, we'd also start forming the Laramie orogeny and the new Rocky Mountains. We had a second event that caused the current Rocky Mountains with some more collision. The Laramie orogeny is a lot of thrusting that has taken place, and some of these rocks are thrown on top of themselves. Severe thrust fold belting in the Rocky Mountains. Again, a thrust fault is a compressive force where the rocks are less than 45 degrees. If it was more than 45 degrees, steeper like this, it would be a reverse fault. But in this case, since it's more horizontal than it is vertical, it's going to be called a thrust fault. And so during the Cretaceous time period, again, this is when we have the first occurrence of mammals, the first occurrence of flowering plants called angiosperms. Modern fish are going to be occurring. So when I say mammals, these are very, very small mammals. But towards the end of the Cretaceous, we know that we had an asteroid event that has occurred. And when we start looking at this asteroid event, it hit in the Yucatan Peninsula in the Gulf of Mexico, and it actually, the structure is still there today. It actually it provides a great oil trap, more on that in a couple of chapters. But this asteroid belt kicked up a lot of dust and created a layer of iridium over most of the Earth. And so we have a really clear defined boundary between the end of the Cretaceous and the end of the Cretaceous, where we end up, we use K for describing the Cretaceous. The end of the Cretaceous is marked by this iridium bed, and we see a lot of dinosaurs below and not much dinosaurs, or virtually no dinosaurs above, aside from the birds. So what time period did the dinosaurs go extinct? In the Cretaceous. And again, this coincides with an asteroid impact, so we'll go ahead and call it as the asteroid impact leading associated with the dinosaur extinction. Some organisms weren't doing well before this. There's been a lot of other hypotheses out there when we start looking at the abundance of these different dinosaurs. Now, speaking of dinosaurs, if we go back to here in Missouri, since materials washed downhill, here during the time of the Cretaceous, we're in a period of erosion. So any dinosaur bones that would have been around here aren't anymore. Those they would have all washed down into periods of deposition, areas of deposition. And so if we wanted to try to find a dinosaur bone, odds are not very good here in Park Hills because we don't have any rocks of the Cretaceous. All of the rocks around here weren't deposited or have been deposited and since washed away. Again, with the exception of that region around Crawley's Ridge. But if you wanted to find a dinosaur, you may want to go a little bit further west to this Cretaceous sea where materials are washing down and accumulating in that interior seaway. And so now we're in the Cenozoic, the recent life region. During the Cenozoic, some notable features. The Himalayan mountains formed where India has now crashed into Eurasia. The San Andreas Fault has occurred. The the southwest part of the United States started pulling apart. And as these rocks pulled apart, this created a series of stretching or extensional faults, a lot of normal faults leaving behind these open ranges and vast basins in between these basin and range topography, Horst and Grabens if you're in different parts of the world. We had a period of global cooling known as the Pleistocene. And so the most recent ice age is called the Pleistocene. And that ended about 10,000 years ago. So during the Cenozoic, here's a map of the Cenozoic, a reconstruction of the Eocene portion of the Cenozoic, where India is about to crash in to Eurasia to form a single landmass. You can see that Africa is also moving further north, and Australia is also moving further further north in those locations. So during the Himalayan orogeny, gotta have a Y on that slide there. I guess it's at that same time, the Alpine region of Switzerland and France occurred, where this collision course buckled up all of the rocks, creating a mountain range of the Alpine mountains of Europe and the Himalayan mountains of Eurasia. In the same time, the Cordilleran is still enlarging, and the Andes mountains are also becoming more mountainous, associated with that subduction of the Pacific plate. So in this region, again, the southwest part of the United States is pulling apart, creating a series of uplifted areas and down thrown areas. And if we take a look at this image, the top of this image up here shows this area where we end up with these rocks getting pulled apart, having detachment faults, having these high and low areas or half grabens associated with this Colorado Plateau. Now, in last chapter, we looked at how can you tell which is older in a cross-cutting relationship. In this area, the Colorado Plateau had a river that was discharging a bunch of water. And so as this area was moving up, the river continued to cut across this area. And so it tried to maintain its course. It was having a wide meanders, And then as this area lifted up, it tried to maintain its course, and it cut down right through those existing events. And so if we try to figure out what has happened first and what happened second, the Colorado River was there before the Colorado Plateau, and it created the Grand Canyon as these rocks were rising up and the river was trying to maintain its course. And so the southwest part of the United States, again, was getting stretched apart there. As a result of that mid-ocean ridge moving into the Baja and then picking up over here in the Pacific Northwest, if I can draw that in, that area, I can try to draw it in. So down here in the southwest part of the United States, we've got a divergence. Pulling this rock apart, and the mid-ocean ridge picks up over here. It's causing this material to move in this direction, this material to move in this direction, and in between the two is that San Andreas Fault. And then we have a trench. Let me see if I can draw that trench right here, the San Juan de Fuca Trench, where this area is getting destroyed to form the Cascade Mountain Range. So yes, this did create the Basin and Range province, but it also, we can see there, and the San Andreas Fault, but it also had a major role when we start looking at some of the other aspects of the Pacific or the western part of the United States here. During the Pleistocene, we had an area where the temperatures cooled. We had a jet stream moving. This also occurred where North America and South America connected, and it disrupted airflow, the global wind patterns, and it led to this Pleistocene ice age, where we end up with vast, long ice ages followed by short interglacials. And we're in one of those interglacials right now, where these ice ages advance, scraping off these materials, and then ice is retreating in those interglacials. There's been a lot of research as to why we go through these ice ages and interglacials. The best explanation that we have so far is in part due to Milankovitch cycles, wobbles associated with the Earth's orbit, and the distribution of continents where we are right now. If we had more land at the North Pole, we would have longer, more ice sheets staying there for longer periods of time. The other aspects is that ocean circulation is interrupted by these continents at this time. Trying to figure out how we get out of these ice ages. Our best hypothesis right now is we started looking at the ocean floor, and if we decrease the amount of water on the ocean floor or during an ice age, sea level will drop. So we put a bunch of water on land, and so this water at the mid-ocean ridge has less pressure building on it, and so more lava can squirt out. And if this lava is coming out, it's releasing more carbon dioxide. And so as a result, it's kind of a natural thermometer that we have here at this time, trying to balance out the Earth from not getting too going into a snowball Earth and not releasing all of its glaciers. This is also a little concerning when we should be going back into an ice age, and our glaciers are melting just about everywhere on Earth. As we start looking at life in the Cenozoic, again, going back to those big eras, recent life, we've now speciated and diversified from the Permian extinction, from the Cenozoic extinction. Forests and grasslands appeared on land. Birds and mammals really took over. About 20 million years ago, we started finding primate fossils, and about 2.4 million years ago, MA, we start seeing species of hominids, a human genus, appearing. And then we start seeing humans, Homo sapiens, about 500,000 years ago. There were other hominids are pretty fascinating. We had Neanderthals at the same time as humans, and they were in different parts of the earth, and ultimately, unfortunately for the Neanderthals, we don't see any full Neanderthal populations after about 225,000 years before present. So life in the Cenozoic would have looked like this, with large giant mammals still filling in that same niche, but different species filling in that niche. The during the the niche of these large organisms that were filling that niche are, again, mammals have replaced the dinosaurs on the land during this Cenozoic time period. Hominids, human-like primates, again, during this time period. Australopithecus, on the right there, we find fossils of them. Lucy being the famous one, about 4 million years ago. And then we started seeing different hominids about 500,000 years ago. I mentioned sea level dropped during that ice age. And during that time period, you would have been able to walk across, and then we can see, looking at trash that was deposited by hominids, we can see the inhabiting leaving Africa, going across Eurasia, Asia, and then into the Americas. And so the Earth today is shaped very much by plate motions and plate tectonics. And so we can start to say, what would happen in the future? And so this is looking at the supercontinent of Pangaea versus present time, which we do not have a supercontinent, but these continents are moving again, and these can occur to have another supercontinent. Pangaea Ultima or Amasia are the two names that I've heard going around talking about the next supercontinent. Now, when we start looking at changes, some changes are unidirectional changes, and a good example that your book gives about this is the moving of the creation of the core, differentiation of the different layers of the Earth. Once that has occurred, it's not going to mix up and happen again. But when we start seeing life on Earth, these different transformations aren't going to necessarily repeat. They're going to occur one way. During the Mesozoic, the land animal is a reptile. Today, the largest animal is the largest land animal is a mammal. Again, filling in those different niches. So if you have any questions about this, be sure to let me know. And I've gone through all of the different quiz questions. These continental cycles going from microcontinents, or from large continents to supercontinents occurring, where these continents are going to collide again. Heat is going to build up, and so what's going to happen in this area, we're going to end up with some convection, ripping these continents again apart, and then we'd end up with back to where these continents would be moving in different directions. So when we start looking at these cyclic changes, sometimes referred to as Wilson cycles, named after Tuzo Wilson, the person who just identified the transform fault. he noted that these continents form these continent supercycles or supercontinent cycles. So when we start looking at, we've mentioned 5 different extinction events. Are we in another extinction event? If we start looking at an informal time period, of the Holocene, of the most recent time period, call it the Anthropocene, where we're changing the environment around us. And there's been a lot of discussion as to when is the start of the Anthropocene. We've been on every continent. We're definitely altering the landscape. And if we have an extinction event, it would definitely be easy to identify at this time. Now, when we start looking at our world population, in 2019, the population of the Earth is about 7.7 billion people, and you can see that the rate is increasing at an increasing rate. And so, notably, there, that Black Death, you can see that mark of that little blip in the scale. But as we're filling in all these different population and environmental niches and living in a more compacted area, we can see that the population of the Earth is continuing to increase, and we could very easily mark our population or our impact on the next layer of the Earth. So if you have any questions about this, please let me know.